Please welcome David Nickles.
Great to be here. So before we get into things, I just want to give a brief disclaimer. A lot of the issues that I'm going to be covering today are incredibly messy. There are no clear answers. There's a lot of really pressing questions. These are things that I've been grappling with. Things that I've been grappling with publicly, I guess, for the last 5 to 6 years, privately for a little bit longer. And I'm going to be really critical of a bunch of stuff. And that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm opposed to sanctioned psychedelic research. That doesn't mean that the institutions and people and things like that I'm going to offer critiques of are that I'm hostile towards their agendas. Rather, I think that there's a lot of stuff that's going on that's not getting discussed, and my intention is to kind of thrust that into the spotlight in a way where we find ourselves having these discussions more publicly. Because any of these conferences you go to, any festival, things like that, you can find these sorts of conversations happening at the margins, but to me, they seem really important to really get into the spotlight. So with that, I'm going to kick things off with a brief definition of terms. So first is radical. When I use radical, I'm using this in the sense of meaning of or relating to a group. So we're talking about notions of affecting fundamental political change, people that recognize that systems go deeper than individual actors, and that ultimately, if we want to see meaningful change, we have to engage with the fundamental nature of the things that we're looking to change. So dominant culture is a term that essentially refers to the most powerful, widespread, or influential cultural components within a social or political entity. For the purpose of this conversation and similar ones, I basically use this as a catch-all for things like white supremacy, industrial civilization, capitalism, these sorts of coercive institutions that permeate and undergird so much of our society. And finally, structural analysis. And this is the notion that society is a complex system that has a whole bunch of different structures and institutions that ultimately function in a way that constrain and affect what choices and actions we have in daily life. And we have to have an understanding of these systems and institutions if we have any desire to change them. If somebody is going to make the assertion that LSD can end war or psychedelics can change the world, they need to be able to articulate how. And if these are the structures and institutions that ultimately control how things work, they need to be able to articulate how these compounds can affect these systems in ways that result in meaningful real-world change. So with that being said, structural analysis, right? Human societies consist of these institutions and systems that we see on a daily basis affect how we interact with each other, how we police and monitor ourselves, and how we go about our daily lives. If we're trying to understand how we relate to each other as individuals, as well as how we relate to these different institutional components, right? How you or I or anyone relates to things like police, to the so-called justice system, to different aspects of society, we have to be able to deconstruct these things and reveal some of the inner workings of them, how they were set up, what their histories are, how they function in the present, and how these things are tied across time. Similarly, we have to understand that these systems are much bigger than the people that participate in them. And in fact, that's one of the more detrimental aspects, right? That people are able to sort of compartmentalize, step back, say, well, I'm just doing this small role, I really don't have control over this. And so we should understand that when people are pushing for individuals, it really doesn't affect much beyond that. A great example is how upset people got over some of the things Trump said about immigration. But if you look, you see that Obama actually deported, the Obama administration deported more people than any administration prior, and Trump's administration is on target to actually deport less people, right? So that perception of, oh, we have a person who represents this versus what the system is actually doing can be fundamentally different. And so finally, I think that it's important for us to acknowledge that just because things exist is not justification for their existence. Just because something is normal or we've been told that it's normal, I mean, in the context of US history, we're talking about a few hundred years. This is a blink of an eye in actual time. And so I think it's important to question the assumptions that anything should be taken for granted or that anything is a given, certainly in any sort of social way. So with that sort of preamble out of the way, here are a few assertions. Ultimately, we're all witnesses and participants in, whether or not we like it, a number of destructive systems. These things play out. We may find ourselves resisting them in various ways. We might find ourselves overwhelmed by them. We may find ourselves grieving them. But ultimately, this is the reality of the world in which we live. When we look at the body of psychedelic literature, both actual case studies and anecdotal reports, we see that there is, without attempting to essentialize the experience, we see that there is a series of themes that kind of emerge from these experiences over time. And without essentializing psychedelics or saying this is what they are, these are what the experiences represent, we can look through the literature and see that these experiences can engender close feelings of openness, feelings of intimacy with nature, feelings of direct connection to the land base, a sense that love is the most important thing out there, or maybe love is all there is. And ultimately, coming away with these understandings leaves us with fundamental changes in our understanding of our own politics, of the way that we function in the world, of the way we relate to power, and the way that we relate to these institutions. With that being said, I think it's really important to point out, as others have this weekend as well, that realizations don't qualify as action. Just because you have an understanding of how things function in the world or how things are problematic or a need for change doesn't actually mean that any change comes from that. So unless you actually figure out what sort of tools you personally need, and it may vary incredibly from one person to the next, from one community to the next, in order to affect the kind of change that you view as important, you're not going to see those realizations, those insights, and those desires amount to much, in my opinion. So with that said, I'd like to get to the heart of today's talk. Right? So my first question is, who or what is mainstream? Right? And when we look around, we're basically left with the sense of dominant culture, right? When we consider what it means to be mainstream, you know, many people talk about being seen on the news, being able to be discussed in the comfort of their home with grandma and grandpa in a way where there's maybe not that stigma, or it's recognized as a commonly used compound. But if we actually look at what the mainstream is made up of, again, we see that these things are incredibly destructive, incredibly coercive, exploitative systems. Things that, you know, perpetuate all sorts of problematic notions about ourselves and how we relate with each other. Again, white supremacy, patriarchy, like these fundamentally interfere with our ability to engage with each other in empathic, genuine, caring ways. So that leads me to the question of, if we think that there's, or if certain people think that there's merit to bringing psychedelics into the mainstream, why? And basically there's sort of two approaches that I've heard most commonly. First is this notion of psychedelics can offer a lot to patients who are struggling with various illnesses, and so by mainstreaming psychedelics, we can remove the taboos around them and provide valuable treatments to this group of patients, or these groups of patients. And that's fine, and in that context, though, there's no engagement with what the effect is on broader society, right? There's no question of what does it do to our understanding of psychedelics to try to find a way for them to peacefully exist with all of these coercive institutions, systems. There's no discussion of, do we have to strip out something essential to these experiences, something that fundamentally challenges what's mainstream in order to make these things mainstream. The second thing, which Sarah touched on briefly this morning, is this notion that you could view psychedelics as becoming mainstream when psychedelic values become mainstream, right? That if there was a way to use these values or bring these values into the mainstream in such a way that they short circuit or override sort of the social default mode network, if you will, right? Like you could essentially set up a society that starts to operate on these principles and where psychedelics are functioning in the mainstream sort of in a coherent and harmonious way with those values. That said, that's not something that seems to be discussed, especially by some of the clinicians who seem a little bit more focused on this idea of mainstream. Which brings me back to this idea of, does it challenge coercive systems? For me, based on my own experiences with psychedelics, the messaging of the need for resistance, the need for challenging these systems of domination and exploitation is kind of unavoidable. So for me, it's very important that if we're talking about mainstreaming psychedelics, we hold on to that radical culture. We hold on to that fundamentally disruptive and unpalatable to institutions of power components that really challenge some of the fundamental assertions about how our society is structured. So also, I think if we're talking about mainstreaming, we have to ask whether or not bringing psychedelics into the mainstream improves our situation as human beings on planet Earth. As we face essentially unparalleled extinctive pressures from climate change, from nuclear proliferation, from an unwillingness in the Republican Party to promote anything resembling even remotely sane policies, I don't really see how bringing psychedelic medicines into the mainstream, purely as medicines, actually starts to address how we're situated as people on this planet. Now, perhaps that notion of inserting psychedelic values and mainstreaming those could offer that, but I'm not particularly clear on the mechanisms that it would take in order for that to happen. And finally, looking at some of the people who are promoting this notion of mainstream psychedelics, a big question is who sets the agenda and what do they have to gain? Are they set to profit, either off of these compounds themselves or off of licensure and certification programs? Are they interested in playing gatekeeper? Are they interested in forms of social control, in forms of social capital and being particularly visible? Or is there another more sane or reasonable justification behind that? I think that anybody who's articulated a desire for mainstream really needs to be able to have a sane, calm discussion about who the shareholders, who the stakeholders, and who the controllers are, and why it is that way. So with that said, I'd like to share this quote from Douglas Rushkoff. Since the 1960s, mainstream media has searched out and co-opted the most authentic things it could find in youth culture, whether that was psychedelic culture, say it's already happened once, anti-war culture, blue jeans culture, eventually heavy metal culture, rap culture, electronica. They'll look for it and they market it back to kids at the mall. And the thing about this, right, is that when we see it getting marketed back to kids at the mall, it usually lacks some fundamental component of what made it attractive in the first place, right? Whether we're looking at hip hop or punk or any of these other subcultures, when it became mainstream, it lost some of its actual radical critique. It loses some components of its analysis of power structures, of what it means to exist outside of that, of what it means to challenge some of these systems. And so I think that there's an important need to question what gets added or lost in the mainstream process. That brings me to this idea of apolitical psychedelics. As I've expressed, I don't think there's any such thing. I don't think it's possible to get around that. And I think we've seen different researchers comment that they would like to see a medical model move forward where radical politics are stripped out, precisely because it's more palatable to the state. And so if we understand politics as power relations, we understand that literally everything is political. How we relate to each other is political. How we relate to our material goods is political, right? And so understanding that the psychedelic is political and that we may have different desires, goals, motivations in these political spaces is okay, and I think really important to actually having real conversations about this. So as I sort of pointed to earlier, right, there are all these themes throughout the psychedelic literature that seem to evidence necessity for action. Right? So even if we stick with one of the more sort of airy-fairy, hippy-dippy notions that all there is love, and love is all you need. Well, if you find yourself living in a society where they're spending billions, if not trillions of dollars on ad revenue designed to tell you that you are an incomplete human being, that you are fundamentally unlovable, that the only way to make yourself a whole functioning member of society is to actually purchase the components that they have manufactured for you to be a whole functioning member of society, then walking around with that notion that no, I am a complete human being, I love myself, I love existence, oh my God, what is this human experience? That's not tenant. That doesn't actually generate economic power, that doesn't create capital, that doesn't allow the machinery to generate profit. And so we see that there's a fundamental political conflict there, whether or not people want to realize that. So as you sit with those sort of realizations and understandings and try to figure out what it looks like to map those onto the world, I think it should be pretty apparent that there are a number of political projects that come out of that. And what that looks like to you versus what that looks like to me will likely depend on our different positions in society, our social critiques, our own desires. And we may not agree on many things, we may not agree on most things. But if we can find areas where we do have those similar understandings about what's going on, the problems we see in the world, I think it's important for us to find space and find opportunities to work with each other to make that change happen. And ultimately, I think, just to underscore it, psychedelic research devoid of radical critique is more palatable to the state apparatus. When you can cast these things in a medical model, when you can present them as providing treatment and cures for specific pathologies and sort of cut out the notion that this might engender any sort of widespread unrest, revolt, throwing off of cultural mores, like these are things that I think make this much easier to sell when you can tell the various certifying bodies that are interested in understanding what this research is going for. It's a way to get them to back off and find this research to actually have some application that doesn't raise those political issues. So in that context, I think it's important to share this quote from Rick Dahlman, who said in Playboy in May of 2017, one of the big mistakes of the 1960s was people identifying as the counterculture. When the crackdown happened, psychedelics got wrapped up with the Cultural Revolution. When you self-identify as part of the counterculture, you check yourself out of things. You kind of marginalize yourself. You don't ask the system to grow and change. Now, the second half of that quote is demonstrably untrue. If we look at things like the role of abolitionists in ending slavery, the role of anarchists in the labor movement, the role of the Black Power movement in the civil rights struggle, the American Indian movement, I mean, it goes on and on. And actually what we see is that it's not actors within an institutional context changing things from the inside that secure the greatest change. It's actually people pushing from the outside, people who have been disenfranchised, people who have no voice, people who have no option but to fight back, and who make it untenable for these coercive systems to continue to grind them into the dust. It's that point where you back the state and its actors into the corner and say you have no option but to meet at least a fraction of our demands if you want to placate us, that you see real change actually come down the pipe historically. And I listed a few options. You can go through the literature and see that that's really consistent across the board. That said, if this is going to be an assertion that appears in such a widely circulated magazine, I think it's important to ask, was 60s counterculture a mistake? Is it a meaningful question or accusation? In my mind, the way that was posed, no. There's no actual critique of any specific events. It's not like he said, the Weather Underground engaged in problematic bombings that didn't actually advance their stated social and political goals. That would be something that you could actually engage with and say, okay, there's some merit to that assertion. This sort of full-scale painting of 60s counterculture as a mistake, as something that got reckless, as something that essentially created problems by removing psychedelics from the lab, well, it sort of glosses over the role that all of these countercultural movements play. Again, we're talking about things like opposition to Vietnam, we're talking about the civil rights struggle, we're talking about women's liberation. We're talking about movements that fundamentally changed the nature of American society, that actually presented wide-scale resistance to some truly horrific things that were going on. And so there's almost this implicit assertion in this quote that either psychedelic users were wrong to express their political dissidence, or political dissidents were mistaken in their use of psychedelics. And bound up in that is this notion that if only we had kept it under wraps, and if only you could have all behaved nicely out in society, we could have continued our research in the lab. Never mind the napalming of Vietnam, never mind, the massacres, never mind the atrocities and lynchings taking place at home. Y'all got too reckless, so you messed it up for us. And to my mind, that's an absurd accusation, because you're implicitly rubber stamping everything that was going on in society that these countercultural movements were challenging. To belabor the point a little bit more, drugs and radical politics and you can't get beyond that, and there's so much evidence, it seems kind of absurd to try to argue against it. So then I think the important question to ask at the end of this is what, if any, lines are we willing to draw in pursuit of the cultural acceptance of psychedelics? Are there people that we're not willing to work with because of the positions they've held? Are there people who have acted in ways that make their relationship to whatever desire you may have from psychedelics untenable? And again, this isn't something that I expect anyone to have an answer to right now, or that even that we would get a coherent answer from this room as a whole. But thinking about that for you personally, as far as what matters to you, what is significant, what would make you want to include or exclude somebody or some components from this push, I think is a really important personal question. So just a few more thoughts on the 60s. Ultimately, the actors and events of the 60s were foundational for where we are today. The good, the bad, the mistakes, the incredible calculations. Ultimately, we don't get to undo any of that. And I think it's important that if we want to offer critiques of this, and if we want to offer analysis of this period of time in order to get a sense of where we are going or where we would like to go, it's important to offer nuanced critiques that actually engage with real events, real people, and the actual goings-on, rather than these broad brushstrokes of this was problematic because it makes me feel like fill in the blank. Political action was and still can be informed by psychedelic experiences. I'm incredibly blown away by the number of people that we encounter on the Nexus and in other forums and real-world spaces who say, hey, I've had these experiences and I don't know what to do with it. I feel called to do something with it, but I don't know what that looks like in actual day-to-day life in my real-world location. And finding ways to plug in where you are, I think, is incredibly important. This notion of like third-world activism, where people run off to places where they have no tie to the culture, to the land base, because they want to help other people. I think it's really important to fight where you stand. I think it's important to figure out what you can do locally, who your peers are, who your allies, who you have affinity with, who you can actually sit down and come up with plans of action as makes sense for your life. And I don't think it's an easy discussion, and I don't think there's easy solutions to it, but if you're not grappling with that and you're having those experiences and that impetus, I think that can be incredibly disorienting. And I think it's understandable that people fear repeating the mistakes of the 60s, but I think in many cases they have a poor understanding of what the mistakes were, right? There's this notion that, again, society got too crazy, sort of couldn't keep its head together amidst the explosion of all of these psychedelics. So they were criminalized, and now we're all a criminal subculture, and we're still grappling with that. And I think coming along with that, we see a lack of meaningful social and political debate within the psychedelic community. I think we see this sort of identity politics notion of, oh, you take drugs and I take drugs, so we must be on the same side. Like, we don't have to worry about anything beyond that because we're both psychonauts, or we're both psychedelic users, or we're both drug users. And I think when we actually see the multiplicity and diversity of people and agendas within these spaces, it's really important that we have some really, I think, harsh discussions about some of these things, because fundamentally what undergirds this psychedelic community and how we choose to march forward, whether it's pursuing legalization or how we choose to network with people that maybe have slightly different goals in this push. If we're not willing to air this dirty laundry publicly and actually hash these things out in public forum and get into the gritty, grimy, really difficult components of this, I don't see how we're ever going to address any of these issues. And finally, I think we have to understand that prohibition of drugs isn't about drugs. It's about social control. And the thing about that is that they feel comfortable stating that publicly. So here's John Ehrlichman, Nixon advisor, who said, the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. So they literally feel comfortable making, and this was made in an interview that Ehrlichman knew was going to get published. The fact that he felt comfortable stating this, I think, is really telling of how secure they feel in their position, right? Like, they knew that there was going to be no political consequences for making this statement. And so if we look at what's going on here, right, we see marginalized communities. We see, again, this notion that even if we go back to that idea that, oh, you hippies ruined this by breaking these compounds out of the lab, we see that it didn't really have anything to do with that. It had everything to do with shutting down this radical political discourse. And if these compounds were feeding that, well, that makes them so much more of a problem to state actors. And in that sense, it's really important to understand that the tools you use you too. Whether we're talking about our political tools or physical tools or whatever, right? So as Normal recently came out when John Boehner joined, Acreage Holdings, right? And said that he had finally seen the light on medical marijuana now that he could, cash in big time with this company that's involved in 11 states and whatever else. Now, mind you, there's countless generally poorer, blacker, browner men, largely, who are still rotting in prison, right? So when Normal comes out and says, we don't really care why John Boehner made this statement, it's a good thing he's coming out in support of legalization, well, what the fuck about all those people who are still rotting in jail? Like,
amen.
Similarly, with MAP's ecstatic newsletter about the Mercers funding ecstasy, it's the same thing. The Mercers have supported white supremacists, nationalists, Nazis, right? Like, you don't get to parse that out and say they gave us $1 million. We can forget about their connections to Breitbart. We can forget about their connections to Bannon. We can forget about the rising of nationalist white supremacists in this country and say, great, thanks for the cash. Similarly, when Tim Ferriss says, hey, I want to throw $1 million at Johns Hopkins, great. I would love for the Hopkins team to have absolutely as much funding as possible. But what is Ferriss angling for? As he's talking about productivity, increasing applications of psychedelics in the workplace, is that something that people want to see? Is that the sort of research that actually makes people excited about advancing psychedelics into broader society?
Nonetheless, it's not a bridge still.
So, we then have issues of floating signifiers of legitimacy and authority. Questions at the end, please. So, first of all, I think we have to recognize that dominant culture and the state are predicated on coercion and violence. The U.S., the starting capital for American capitalism comes from slavery and genocide. You don't get to get around it, right? Everything that has existed since then is predicated on that. And if we look at the social constructs that still exist, right, if we consider something like policing, first, the notion of violence doesn't apply to the state. So there was a famous newspaper article during the riots in Quebec around the free trade meetings, right, where it said, protests turned violent when protesters threw tear gas canisters back at the police. Okay. So if we look at policing in the United States, right, the modern police force stems from southern slave-catching gangs and northern city watches that were tasked with removing undesirable classes of people. Immigrants, vagrants, prostitutes. You go through, it was literally a class-based enforcement system in the North and the South being that much more horrific. But ultimately, this authority, whether we're talking state or otherwise, isn't self-justifying. If somebody says you can't do something, they need to be able to provide a good reason as to why you can't do that. If they can't justify that authority, it's not legitimate. So with that understanding, and the understanding of the criminalization efforts of psychedelics, we see that there was no justification for the criminalization of psychedelics. It wasn't based on empirical evidence, it wasn't based on risk following ingestion, it wasn't based on anything other than the political will to do so. So with that being said, to me, it's pretty apparent that psychedelics belong in the public domain. That medical, spiritual, intellectual, and recreational applications are all equally valid, and that ultimately, we don't need to justify these things, we shouldn't need to justify these things as medical treatments to bring them back into society because they weren't removed due to problematic issues with their ingestion or with the effects on people, right? So with that being said, if we look at what's actually gone on in the realm of mainstreaming, I think there's sort of four major categories that are worth looking at. So first is this guru model. Over the last decade, we've seen an explosion in retreat centers, both abroad and at home. With this, there have been a huge skyrocketing of sexual assault allegations, of dangerous preparations, of people making incorrect legal claims specifically about centers in the US, but elsewhere as well. And we see at the bottom of this, at the heart of this, there's a profit motive, right? There's good money to be made by setting up a retreat center, parading it around as authentic, and figuring out who you can bring to come, right? And so there's also all of these issues of how shamanic tourism affects local economies, how it affects local ecosystems, what actually happens in these interchanges between people who are generally wealthier from the global north and generally taking these trips without much consideration for their effects after they depart from whatever location they've attended. We've also seen a spiking of psychedelics in the workplace. Now, I think it's important to note that we don't actually have any good studies on the efficacy of microdosing. Yet, despite that, there have been at least a handful of vocal proponents who seem very set on the idea that particularly microdoses of LSD will increase creativity, worker productivity, that if you're in Silicon Valley, give it to your coders and oh my God, the stuff that comes out, you'll be raking in the cash. Now, I think it's really interesting if we consider that, 50, 60 years ago, LSD was viewed as such an intense boundary dissolving compound that it was seen as a threat to the very fabric of society. And now it's being repitched as, but you take a very small dose, and rather than challenging society, you become a model citizen. You become so much more productive, and you fit in these great ways. So really, it's not disruptive at all. It's just about the dose. And to me, again, that's incredibly alarming, especially when we consider the social and ecological costs of Silicon Valley, where this is really getting bandied about. If we consider the ecological cost of the server farm, of all of the power it takes to support all of those, of all of the logistics for shipping this stuff around the world, for mining it, refining it. I mean, it's, to me, pretty atrocious that the notion of microdosing LSD to support this incredibly destructive industry. So we also see psychedelics for greenwashing. And this is sort of this notion where CEOs will go to a retreat center, make a statement like, Wachuma is the medicine that might bring the world together, and then go back to running whatever sort of industrial production facility that they're running in order to produce consumer goods, medical supplements, barbells, whatever else. And like there's no recognition that somehow they're interfaced with this, right? Like if you're actually looking to bring people together and mend the ruptures in society around the world, that maybe having workers that are being exploited in these factories, maybe having all of the waste and the runoff from these things that are affecting local ecosystems, maybe trying to figure out a way to stop that where you have that ability to do so rather than coming back and saying we all need to sing Kumbaya might be a little bit more effective. Now, I'm not saying that one person shutting down their factory actually represents a significant drop in the bucket in the sense of global industrial capitalism, but at the same time, right, that disconnect seems rather alarming to me. And finally, there's the issue of psychedelics in the military. As we've seen the explosion of interest in the treatment of trauma-resistant PTSD, we've seen an increasing closeness between particularly MAPS and the Department of Defense in Canada. And I'm a little alarmed by the potential, especially as we're seeing an increase in the use of drone warfare, spiking issues of PTSD among drone operators, and an increase in what has been labeled, illegal military attacks and bombings. We're looking at conservatively between 1 to 2 million civilian casualties in Iraq and Afghanistan. The notion that the military would be situated to say, hey, don't worry about where we deploy our troops, because when we bring them back, we've got a treatment for that, we can reintegrate them into society, and you won't have to worry about your neighbors living in that. You won't have to worry about outbursts, you won't have to worry about anything, you've got it covered. To me, I find that potential rather alarming. So there's a lot more to say on that. I think there may be time to cover a little bit more, but for the moment, I'd like to bring it back to the medical model. So this is the dominant approach to psychedelic research. And understandably, it doesn't really engage with any sort of systemic analysis or structural critique. It generally focuses on individual outcomes and therapeutic interventions, and that's great. Like, I think that there's really a lot to offer there. And certainly, to bring it back to the military case, like, I'm not suggesting that vets or anyone else suffering from trauma shouldn't have access to anything that improves their situation. I'm saying that beyond looking at the individual, we need to look at the systems. We need to understand how we reinforce some of these coercive power structures and actually question if the medical model and if the way that we're pushing for mainstreaming of psychedelics within that context doesn't beyond making sick people better. And finally, there's this notion, the emphasis on rescheduling and legalization, and this sense that the medical model can Trojan horse psychedelics into mainstream society for all of us. And I understand that, and I'm sympathetic to it, but I think that when you're building something, how you shape the foundation fundamentally affects what you can put on top of it. And so, depending on what the medical context is, how it's ultimately approved, regulated, who gets access, we find ourselves again facing all of these questions of legitimacy, authority, gatekeepers, and who gets to control access. So some more issues with the medical model. To quote Nick Sand, psychedelics are not solely about curing ill people, but about making well people weller. We're not just beasts brought to work and walk in one path all of our lives, we are here to fly. And psychedelics offer truly paradigm-shattering ontological and epistemological questions. I mean, these things challenge the essential questions of what it means to be human, what it means to share space with other humans and animals and plants on this little planet that's rocketing through space at ridiculous speeds, right? There are all of these other things that crop up outside of the medical model that are incredibly important and that I think just don't fit into the medical model, even if you could make an argument that, oh, it could cram in or it could be an outcropping or this, that, and the other. And I think it's important to hold the legitimacy of psychonautica, right? Similarly, the legitimacy of the medical community in relation to psychedelics is predicated on prohibitionist dynamics. So again, this is back to that notion that we are a medical community, we are responsible, we know what we're doing with these compounds, and we're capable of giving them out. But again, it comes back to this notion that that's not why psychedelics were criminalized in the first place. So that, again, it sort of buys into that oppressor logic of, you couldn't handle this, so we took them away, justify it to me why I should give it back to you. And that simply never happened. That's not the reason that we're in this position. And so I think falling into that game creates a dynamic where we're already set up to lose. I also find some amusement when the clinicians talk about psychedelics being so amazing because they offer these actual treatments. I'm hesitant to use cure. I'm not a clinician, obviously. I don't think that that's the term that would be used. But looking at the way that psychedelics are being applied in the clinical model, it almost presents systemic symptom management rather than a cultural cure, right? Where here we are finding ways to provide functionality for people in a sick, fucked up culture rather than actually addressing the fundamental causes of that sick, fucked up culture. So, as was also pointed out briefly by Sarah this morning, medicine has been systemically racist in classes. Focusing just on the U.S. model, if we look at anything like, the Tuskegee Airmen and all of the sort of horrific medical experiments that have been carried out on people of color, on women, on other marginalized populations, the notion that somehow medicine is capable of carrying these things out or is in an unimpeachable moral or ethical position, and maybe clinicians wouldn't actually argue that, but that seems to be some of the sort of presentation made, right? Like, we are unassailable, we are in a position where we are caretakers, where we have this reputation that supports our access to psychedelics, even if all these normal people can't quite handle it. And finally, respectability politics are classist and exclusionary. And so respectability politics is basically this notion where members of marginalized communities essentially try to show dominant culture that their values are actually consistent with those of dominant culture. And frankly, speaking for myself, they're not. Like, I have no interest in psychedelics becoming, you know, a nice, peacefully coexisting component of dominant culture. And I think it's important for people to be able to call this out. I think it's important for people to be able to point to some of the class and racial privilege that comes with these assertions about how psychedelics need or should fit into the mainstream. So, if we want to see psychedelic propagation, if we want to see the psychedelic community expand and grow and become more freewheeling and accepted, I think we have to accept that harm reduction is necessary for its dissemination. If people can't have these experiences in safe manners, in ways where they feel cared for, in ways where they can integrate the experiences afterward, come to community, have meaningful dialogue around these experiences and what to do with them, then I don't think we're going to see any of this spread, because how could it, right? Like, the notion of psychedelic culture is literally predicated on the psychedelic experience. So if we can't find ways to make those accessible to other people, and I'm certainly not expressing a desire to like put this in the drugstore and figure out a way to like, you know, get every single person who walks in to dose. But when somebody expresses interest, I think it's really important to make sure that they have all of the tools and that we are there to walk them through as much as possible. And this is something we've seen in a major way in the DMT nexus, where we put out all of these extraction methodologies. All of a sudden, DMT became, I mean, you can go to any festival and you'll find people selling it, you'll smell it being smoked from everywhere. And like, the degree to which it's available has led to an explosion in the number of people who have smoked it without really knowing what it was, having experiences and coming back to us saying, oh my God, what the hell happened? And so, as much as I lament the fact that sort of the level of heady discussion around ontological concepts and extraction and phytochemistry is kind of plummeted, at the same time, like, we're now reaping the whirlwind of what we put out there. And we have, I think, at least some of the responsibility to actually make sure that people aren't in dangerous positions. Now, this reminds me of the quote, another quote Sarah shared this morning, dealing with the sharp scalpel, right? I forget which clinician initially said it, but basically made the analogy that psychedelics are like a sharp scalpel in the hands of the surgeon that can save lives, and you've got a bunch of kids in dark graves bumping into each other, it makes problems. But I think it's really interesting. You know, if we consider a scalpel as ultimately being a knife, right? Like, we see that we teach our children how to use knives, right? Like, we have knives proliferating throughout our culture, and actually, in most ways, they improve our lives. They make certain things really easy. We find that with proper understanding about the dangers of them, even relatively young people are able to use them quite confidently. So I think that it's a perfectly fine analogy, it just hasn't been considered wrong. Similarly, I think it's important to understand that different communities have different goals and priorities, and that's okay. I think that, again, finding the spaces where we have affinity with each other is important. Finding out where we have differences and fleshing out those differences and understanding why and actually engaging in that dialogue is super important, because that's how we grow, that's how our understanding shifts, that's how we find new ways of engaging in the world. And so rather than shying away from conflict and disagreement and spats at conferences or online or wherever, I think we should kind of be aiming to have this clash of ideas, to sort of bring things into the melting pot, make as big of a mess as possible, and see what comes out, because it's already a huge mess. And so I think owning the degree of mess it is and just kind of smearing it all over the place and seeing what comes out is actually really important to the process. So exactly that, right? Robust debate is necessary and beneficial, but robust debate is also the starting point, right? Once you have the debate, if similar to the experience, if you don't do anything with it, if you don't put those understandings into practice, into the world, ultimately it's meaningless. Ultimately it doesn't affect anything. So with that being said, I'd like to sort of present this idea of radical psychedelic engagement. And basically, all it means is turning psychedelic insight into practice, right? This notion of you have an experience, it leaves you with an impetus to do something, or it leaves you with a really significant emotional feeling. It leaves you with a desire to fill in the blank, right? And then it's about figuring out how to turn that into action figuring out ways to apply that insight that affects change. And there's so many different ways of doing that, right? Even if you look at just the way you interact with other people on a daily basis, those sort of power dynamics, that level of politics can actually be incredibly transformative, both when people see other folks acting with empathy, particularly in stressful situations. Mass transit is a great opportunity, right? Like, there are so many ways to really demonstrate to other people how you'd like to see them engage with the world just by how you engage with the world. And finally, I think perhaps the most pressing question of all is, what kind of world do we want to live in? As we race towards the precipice, as we see all of the problems that are continuing to unfold, in many cases unchecked, I think the guiding question throughout much of this really needs to be one that holds us to account for what our intentions are. What do we want to see take place, and how would we like to see that happen? We may not have the tools to carry that out ourselves. We may not, even in groups, have the tools to carry that out together. And I don't think that visualizing utopias or reaching for utopias is beneficial because we're ever going to get there. But I do think that by having those ideas and those concepts and striving for them as ideals actually brings material changes that can improve our daily lives. Even if there's no hope of shaking off the issues of industrial capitalism in any meaningful way, even if ultimately we're doomed and we're not going to see any significant change in the U.S. as far as ecological policy or denuclearization or anything like that, I think that by striving for some of these things in our own lives, we can make our lives better for us and those around us, and I do think that's important. So thank you. So we've got some time for questions. Start with that.
One of the clarifications. One of the things we sit here with our cell phones, that computers, and all controlling the products that we're using, we're perpetuating the us versus them mentality by pointing the finger at the state for businesses. And at the end of the day, as human beings, a lot of times we're very confused in what we're doing. And so one of the jobs that I have, I actually work in business with a lot of leaders that are trying to figure out the same issue. And I'm not here advocating that business doesn't harm the environment. I'm not taking a position. I'm just suggesting that sometimes when we point the finger or create additional separation, that we just perpetuate that mentality. We're already all caught in an echo chamber of the shit that previous ancestors have done that we're all living. So I don't really know the solution for that other than sitting with other people that are really trying to figure this out, because how do you just turn off coal control? It's really complicated. How do you just shut off silicon valley to have a huge economic impact, to have a huge environmental impact in one way? It's just a suggestion that for us as a community, conscious that our highest awareness that we all are one thing, we're all in this together, trying to figure out how to make the most beneficial for whatever life it is that we all want to have. I just wanted to put that out there.
Sure.
Thank you for the presentation.
For sure. And I appreciate the perspective. I guess I'd like to push back gently against the notion that we as individual consumers have any purchasing power. If we actually look at the statistics, we see that it's corporations and militaries that account for the majority of product purchasing and things of that nature, like production. And obviously all of those groups are made up of people, right? Except that corporations and the military function as private tyrannies, right? Like they're hierarchical institutions where it's top-down control, and the people that are operating with those understanding, or the people that are actually getting those materials in the field or in their job, don't actually have any control over that, right? So,
No, absolutely, we all do. And if we just participated, we're participating around that.
So,
we have control.
okay, so
I'm sorry.
I'd still like to finish. So I think it's also important to recognize that like you don't really have an option to not participate, right? Like vagrancy and homelessness are criminalized. Like where do I go? If I don't want to participate in American society, what, I go to a national forest somewhere in a camp? Like, and even if I find a way to remove myself from society, right? Like ultimately that doesn't do me any good at the point where the life support systems on Spaceship Earth fail. I'm still just as fucked as everybody else. So I don't really think it's about like, do I participate, do I unplug? I think it's very much about trying to figure out ways to short circuit and actually interfere with those things. Similarly, I don't think that I'm better served by stripping off all my clothing, eschewing all of my electronics and saying, hey, like, I'm not going to use petroleum in any way, so I can't show up to this conference, I can't wear any, like, I literally couldn't put these messages out if I didn't utilize this. And yet my lack of utilization of any of this isn't even a drop in the bucket, right? Like if I were to throw all of this into the corner and say, I'm done, the only thing that changes is that this voice and whatever sort of debate and discussion we're about to have just doesn't happen. So I don't know that I actually see that as like a strategy towards digging in. And frankly, like some of the folks that are running these corporations know exactly what they're doing, right? So if you look at like Apple, right, the way that these things are structured, the CEO, you could show them every horrific process and they could say, oh my God, we need to stop this right now. And they show up at the shareholder meeting and the board says, haha, fuck you, we've got a replacement CEO. So again, like there are checks and balances that literally function to ensure that these power structures stay entrenched. And I do think that there's class conflict there. I don't think I have shared interest with those people. And I think the obliteration of class consciousness in lower classes among working people in the United States has been one of the most detrimental components of everything that's happened post-60s.
Thank you. So I very much appreciate your warrior spirit and being on that path. It's like we all have to pass it clearly to understand. I would like to caution you though, as our other friend sort of mentioned, that if you continue to look at others as an other and as an adversary and confront them, perhaps violently, that's going to continue the cycle of violence. If you can find some compassion for them and realize that they too are being led along by the system that is based upon incentive structures that were set up before any of us came along currently, because almost none of us were alive when any of these things started to take place. That they're stuck in it as much as you are, and the thing that will make this change is if we can get together and realize that we really are all one being, and we need to keep each other outside.
Thank you. No, I really appreciate that because I think this really underscores the need for structural analysis. So can you explain then through that mechanism how that happens, right? How do you actually get those class disinterests in coherence?
We actually have to have a conversation. So what is it?
But again, like,
you actually put people together in a room. You take an activist community, you take a swage, you take people from Los Angeles, and the activist community sit in the room, and they actually try to figure out how to unravel it. So there are mechanisms to do this. It's just you have to actually seek out those dialogues from a non-adversarial standpoint.
I disagree fundamentally. I think that we've seen it with psychedelic medicine. We've seen it, with psychedelic practice, right? We've seen it where mining companies have come into ayahuasca, traditional indigenous ayahuasca using communities, and have attempted to secure their land rights, secure their mining rights, right? And there's actually a really great article on this on Shakruna that I would highly recommend that you folks read because you see that there are antagonistic interests, right? This isn't about we come into the same room and we have a dialogue around this. These folks are actively poisoning the water, air, and land. This isn't something where we're all one and everything is happy and everything is fine. And this comes back to the issue of violence, right? This comes back to systemic violence. This comes back to coercion. This comes back to the fact that literally everything that's going on, like the way private property works, that's all enforced down the barrel of a gun. Just because you're in a privileged position where you don't come up against the sheriff that the landlord calls when you can't afford rent, just because you're able to live in one of the houses we literally have so many vacant houses that we could move homeless folks in there and solve the homeless crisis, right? Except that you can't give away capital like that, because all of a sudden it disincentivizes the entire system. Similarly, that's why they've got police that guard shipments that are going to the dumpster from groceries. Like this violence is at every single intersection of the society, and it's so frustrating that that all gets glossed over. Over here.
Wait, could we have someone who's not a white man?
Yes, that's great. I appreciate that. Yeah, we have one in the back, but
Okay, so I just want to say that everything you're saying is probably true, but there are equally, and you have to accept this because we are in a planet of duality. And for every atrocity we're talking about, there are wonderful things happening in corporate America. And it's the wonderful philosopher Krishnamurti said, we are a revolution of one.
So
I start a revolution, I change within, I get into dialogue, and I have empathy and love for the process, for humanity, for my planet, and we change.
That, like, again, we live within the context of industrial capitalism. Literally, all of us, all of our homes are predicated on human and ecological destruction and suffering. All of our cars, all of our
And I don't want to
technology.
share that illusion. Not all of us do, and I don't want to share that illusion. I want to live in a world where I know I have control over my own destiny.
But what I'm saying is just because you don't see it, right? Like, this is that.
I don't need to see what you see. I need to see what I see, and then I can control
Okay, so
my
like,
I just wanted to share, I was out at Standing Rock for a little bit, and I come from just a purely observational perspective. I spent a lot of my time picking up trash and talking to people individually. And I just wanted to revisit, I don't remember what speaker said it, but revisit the idea of purging this stuff and grieving on a collective level, on a macro level. Because some of these things need to come out and need to be experienced in a collective way. And I think that one of the things that I've learned with plant medicine primarily is not to judge that process and just be with it. So I'm trying to think of it in terms of how we can approach this grieving and hold space for that, because I've met a lot of people that are in situations that you're talking about where I just literally had to deny one of my best friends a couch to sleep on because my boyfriend didn't go get along with her diagnosis at home, and I had to deal with that. And he's trying to get assistance with it and he can't, and so he's hitting these roadblocks, and he's really angry, and to tell him from my privileged perspective, denying him a house because my boyfriend doesn't get along with her diagnosis and facilitates PTSD, and it's not responsible to me to have one in the same place. He's homeless now. So he needs to express his anger with me, and I need to understand that that's coming from a valid place, and that comes from a place that's bigger than hard for me to do. I just wanted to remind everyone that it's a macro treatment process. I think that we kind of overstated that a 1 minute in the same way that I would if I was facilitating for someone who had different trauma than I had.
Sure, and I think that point about different trauma is really important, right? Like, I think that notion of understanding that just because our lived experience is one where we don't see that suffering, or we don't experience that, where maybe we don't live by the landfill, we don't live by the locally unwanted land use, or we don't live by the nuclear plant, we don't live by the processing and mining and refining, right? Like, just because we don't see that in our daily lives, like, everything that comes from that still has all of those detrimental effects. The same way all of these structures that we run into in our social engagements, right? Like, just because we don't find ourselves necessarily on the street doesn't mean that those things aren't happening, that it doesn't affect us in ways that put us in incredibly difficult positions. And like I said, I don't think there's easy answers for any of this, and I'd like to see a lot more conversation in that. So thanks for all making that possible.